Starting in 1 minute. Here we go. Well, welcome back, everybody. This is our last session for the day and for the 3-day conference. It has been a marathon. Thank you very much for staying with us and for contributing and asking questions. That contribution has really meant a lot to the richness of our conference. Now, for the last session, we are going to look at why building a database of hate is so important. This discussion will be chaired by my colleague, CRIS Research Fellow, Professor Greg Barton, who is a member of our Building Resilience to Social Harm research team, as well as a professor of global Islamic politics at Alfred Deakin Institute, Deakin University. So Greg, over to you.
Thank you, Shahram, and thank you all. It's been good to see people staying the course through the 3 days. Doing this via Zoom is not ideal. We look forward next year to doing something different, but it's good to be able to do this nevertheless, because it's such an important topic. We've only got a fairly brief window for this final session of our 3-day conference, so I'll get into it quickly. 3 excellent panelists, very experienced. The title of this panel, of course, has its own answer. Why do we need a database of hate? ? Advancing fairness, equity, equality, respect, and understanding. And we're not into databases for databases' sake. It's about trying to resolve these issues, trying to address hate. I'll introduce the 3 panelists as they speak. So first up is Nicole. Nicole is Professor of Policing and Emergency Management in the School of Social Sciences at UTAS. She was at Western Sydney University and at Deakin University. She has served in policing services for 25 years. Most of her career has been dealing with vulnerable victims. She's got 3 books out on this topic of policing and vulnerable victims. So really excellent match for our discussion now. I'll pass directly to Nicole since our time is so short. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Greg, and I pay my respects to elders past and present of the Palawa and Muawina people of Lutruwita, talking from Tasmania, where we have just created our first initial working group on prejudice-related violence. Tasmania is one of those jurisdictions that has very few provisions, and therefore very little of hate crime is actually captured by the police. Thinking through why we need a database, and in fact why we need an independent database from police, I think is one of the critical things is that many of the communities who experience targeted violence have an estranged relationship with the police, whether that's Muslim communities who have been under the surveillance of police since 9/11 at least, but earlier as well. But also LGBTIQ people who, until, in the case of Tasmania, till 1997, were in fact criminalised. So we need an independent reporting database for hate crime so that we can capture all the incidents. We know that there is what's called the dark figure of crime, and that's that all those crimes and incidents that never come to the attention of the police. And having somebody, having an organisation, a database separate from the police ensures that we capture that dark figure. We know that the reporting rate for hate crime in Australia is very, very low. And in part, I think that is unlike the UK because we have a police-centred approach to hate crime where only the police can determine whether something is a hate crime or not, whilst in the UK, it is a victim-centred approach, which allows victims to nominate something as a hate crime or a hate incident. As we all know, crime is socially constructed. So what is a crime today may not be tomorrow, but vice versa. So we need to be capturing hate crime incidents as well as hate crimes, because at some point those incidents may be in fact crimes, but also because it gives us an insight to the patterns. What I found in my research with the London Metropolitan Police was that the speech used was linked to the hate crime that followed it, and that if we don't capture these hate incidents, which are normally what I would call hate speech or textual hostility, if we don't capture those, we don't capture the motivation, the prejudice motivation. So when somebody does eventually contact the police, then they don't have a pattern to be talking to, and they don't have the evidence to show that motivation. So in the research that I was looking at, there was a direct relationship between the words actually used and the crimes that were perpetrated. So if a perpetrator called somebody dirty or disgusting, some kind of pathologizing speech, then the likelihood of a crime such as throwing rubbish on the property's home or throwing rubbish at a person is increased. Same with sexualization or pathologization, criminalization, they're all linked to specific actions as well. So capturing this also gives police and victims an insight into what possibly could follow from these speech acts, what could happen next. So capturing that information is really critical. But my final point I want to make before I pass on to the other panelists is that access to data and sovereignty of that data is quite critical for some communities. We don't want data held by an organisation who puts out an annual report each year with aggregate data telling us the top line results. We want communities to be able to access the data so they can use it in order to provide tertiary bespoke victim support services, but also to move upstream and look at what we need to do to prevent the kinds of harms that are experienced by communities. I think we need to work collaboratively on this as both government and non-government sectors, because there are some within targeted communities that are a little less privileged than others in respect to resourcing. And here I particularly think about ageist, ableist, heterosexist and cissexist violence that is not often captured in police reporting, and those NGOs linked to those communities often don't have the resources to collect that data themselves. So building on the work that's already been done particularly around racist violence, but also anti-Semitic, with the Jewish community in Australia setting the scene for many other communities in how to respond to hate crime. I think bringing those communities together enables us to lift all boats, should I say, in this time of COVID, to enable others who experience targeted violence, and often in very similar ways, to be able to access the resources and the support needed. The one last point I'd like to make is that there are some forms of hate crime against some communities that are outliers, that are not shared by any other community. And as a collaborative effort, we can raise those voices about those unique experiences. And I think at the beginning of COVID, we saw some of these unique aspects, particularly in regards to ableist violence. One of the things that we are seeing as a pattern in ableist hate crime is the minimising it as neglect, but also not recognising the absolutely horrendous role of starvation as a form of hate crime against people who need care. So working collaboratively, working on a shared database that is accessible to communities for their use, I think is the most critical thing that we can do moving forward in order to provide support, but also to prevent hate crime. Thanks, Greg, for the time.
Thanks very much, Nicole. Those are really good, concrete points. We'll hopefully have a few minutes for discussion shortly, but I'll pass directly to Peter. Peter has worked at the Executive Council of Australian Jewry for nearly 30 years, and he's also worked, overlapping a little, as a lawyer for 32 years. And during that period, he's been an honorary solicitor for a number of charities in the Jewish and wider communities. So it meant that earlier, last decade, he worked on a series of racial vilification cases in the federal court. He was president of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies from 96 to 2000, made a member of the Order of Australia in 2003 for his services. He served on the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board from 2004 through to 2015, so a state body. And then in 2010, he was appointed to the Australian Federal Government's Australian Multicultural Advisory Council and then the Australian Multicultural Council. So he's got immense experience working on issues both in terms of positive affirmation of multiculturalism and respect, democracy and social cohesion, but also dealing specifically with these questions of hate crimes and hate incidents. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Greg. Firstly, I'll acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm situated, as the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I endorse everything Nicole said. If we're going to develop a national database of hate crime, it's got to be a collaborative effort between communities and government. Communities for too long have just been left very largely to their own devices in terms of recording hate incidents that are directed against them in particular. And the limits of the usefulness of that for government policy are pretty obvious, because it gives you a rather narrow picture and not necessarily a sound basis for formulating government policy across the nation. At the moment, we have hate crimes units in some of the states and territories, but there is no uniformity or consistency in approach in the way they classify an offence as a hate crime. There's no consistency in the criteria that they use to define a hate motivation. There's no consistency either in terms of the attributes which are the basis of the hate which are recorded. And so effectively we have a lot of siloed jurisdictions that record hate motivated crime and hate crime to a limited degree, but in a way that makes it almost impossible to compare from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and draw a bigger picture of the state of the nation, as it were, when it comes to this phenomenon. And it is an increasingly prevalent phenomenon. We've seen just recently with the lockdown protests in Victoria how strange a mixture of people that ended up attracting. So, for example, you had on the one hand trade unionists who were protesting about compulsory vaccination as a condition of employment. It was, nothing to do with it. And on the other hand, you had other people who were neo-Nazis who were trying to latch on to the conspiracy theorists among the anti-vaxxers and prosecuting a hate motivation case, if you like, on the back of that general sentiment. So this is something that Australia seems to not be immune to any more than any other country. It's something that it's a phenomenon which times of crisis, times of emergency, times of stress seem to bring out. And so the need for it just becomes greater and greater. And the fact that Australia does not have a uniform national system across jurisdictions to define, classify, record, train police and report on hate crime makes it virtually impossible to come up with any kind of sensible evidence-based policy across the nation to address it, which is the point I think Greg started out with. So where to begin? Well, I mean, Australia doesn't really have to reinvent the wheel entirely. There are uniform national systems in place and have been in place for decades in the United Kingdom and also in other federations such as the United States and Canada. And even though there are differences in the laws from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in, say, the United States and in Canada, that has not acted as an impediment to putting into place a uniform national system for defining, classifying, recording hate crime. They've managed to do it for the last 30 years. We can do it as well. The best systems seem to be the ones where there is, as Nicole pointed out, cooperation between communities and law enforcement. And that is the model that we've been working on. We put together a paper with the assistance of people like Nicole and Gail Mason in Sydney and others. And my organisation has done that and submitted it to the Race Discrimination Commissioner. That's in turn been passed on to the Attorney General's office. But at the moment, it's in the too hard basket as far as I can gather. I mean, I've made some inquiries and it seems to be something that governments find it very difficult to get their heads around, but it does require some government action to put in place the resources and the system needed to get uniformity and consistency of approach across the country so that we can address this problem sensibly. Until that happens, we're just going to continue as we have been, and that's a really imperfect situation which is getting less and less tenable.
Thank you, Peter. Very well said. We'll go straight to Josh so we can get into a little bit of discussion of these issues because this is really important stuff. Let me introduce the Honourable Josh Bull, MP. Josh is a member for Sunbury. Sunbury is a new electorate in the northwest, so the outer suburbs of Melbourne in the northwest. Created in 2013, so Josh won this seat for the first time when it was available in 2014, and then of course was re-elected in the 2018 Victorian state election. He was appointed Victoria's first Parliamentary Secretary for Youth and Parliamentary Secretary for Multicultural Affairs since 2018. And he is the co-chair of the Victorian Anti-Racism Task Force. We've been talking particularly at Deakin about starting off with a pilot project on hate in Victoria just to make it doable. Of course, the aspiration is national, but Victoria is a good place to start. So really great to have you here speaking to us, Josh. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you for that warm introduction and all of the wonderful work that you do. Can I also acknowledge Nicole and Peter and your really important contributions that have just been made. I have to say that I agree with just about everything that you both said, so thank you. Can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders both past and present. So I'm really fortunate to be the Parliamentary Secretary for Multicultural Affairs and Youth, and very pleased to be the co-chair of the Victorian Government's Anti-Racism Task Force. I'm really grateful to be part of this session, to have the opportunity, I think, to practically speak about how we as a government, we as a society and a community can better manage issues of hate speech and discrimination. Can I also thank the Centre for Resilient and Inclusive Societies for inviting me to participate in this afternoon and all of this important work that is being done. I hope that the last 2.5 days have been filled with insightful discussions. So in Victoria, we come from over 200 different countries. We speak 260 different languages and follow more than 135 different faiths. However, we know that our multiculturalism, our inclusive society has not just happened by accident. It's through, of course, the commitment, the courage that many organisations and citizens have brought together to bring change, championing voices and embracing, of course, each other's diversity. We know that this diversity is a strength in any society, but it's something that we need to continually nurture and something that we continually need to work on, both as a government and both within the community. Apologies, I've got my email going off in the background there, so I'll try and minimise any more disruptions. But also, of course, we know that our multiculturalism brings new ideas, extends our skills, attracts new businesses and creates jobs. But one of the things that unfortunately we have seen, particularly over these past 18 months through the COVID-19 pandemic, has been the challenges that have arisen disproportionately, I'd say, towards our multicultural communities in Victoria. And I think both Nicole and Peter touched on this in their contributions. We live in a progressive, multicultural and multi-faith society, but incidents of racism sadly exist in all parts of our state and have increased throughout the pandemic. Our stance is really clear as a government. Racism and discrimination of any kind are categorically rejected in Victoria. And whilst the government works hard to instill in all Victorians those values that we hold so close, we know that significant efforts to support Victorians are made both at a grassroots level, at a community level, and the wonderful work that's done thanks to our multicultural and multi-faith leaders. Throughout the pandemic, though, in particular, it's been these leaders that have continued to work tirelessly over those 18 months to maintain connections through the really tough times that we've faced. They've assisted with food, with medical donations, helped with translations of health advice, and moved cultural and religious celebrations online, as we are today, to keep everyone safe. And I'm really proud of this work. It's an incredible amount of work that's been done through a really difficult time for our state. I do want to briefly, and I am conscious of time, Greg, so I won't go on for too much longer because I know we want to do some questions, but I just wanted to speak about some important progress that's been made in responding to and reducing the prevalence of racism and hate speech. We know that institutional barriers can prevent culturally and linguistically diverse people from participating in civic processes that shape our society, and the government is taking significant steps to combat these issues. We do, of course, have the establishment of the Anti-Racism Task Force that will drive the development of a statewide anti-racism strategy that we hope to release by May next year. And Peter, I think, spoke quite comprehensively about the work that's been done to have a uniform approach across the country. And I think that's incredibly important. But we also know from a state level, we need to make sure that we've got a uniform approach across the state. The strategy will seek to proactively prevent and address racism in Victoria, considering how and where racism occurs, best practice responses that effectively respond to and reduce the prevalence of racism. I'm really keen to ensure that the strategy encompasses the views of the wider community, and we're now going through our community consultation process just this very week, or commencing in full next week. Consultation will be broad, it'll be targeted, it'll ensure that the government's efforts are directed to where we need to direct them most. We know that whether it's in the workplace, whether it's on the sporting field, or whether it's in the classroom, these are really important moments in people's lives, and we need to do everything we can to reduce racism within our community. The other thing I just wanted to mention very briefly was we have made an announcement about banning the Nazi hate symbol, which was a significant step for this state, and some powerful work that was done by one of our parliamentary committees. I should also note that that had bipartisan support, which was something that was very pleasing. Just finally, I do want to acknowledge the collaborative efforts between government and NGOs. We're aware, of course, that the focus on legislative instruments to address these issues are complex, but it's essential that we implement adequate policy and program responses, educational initiatives, communications to do this work together. The government and non-government bodies need to, of course, work collaboratively to achieve those positive outcomes. But I think we all know in this online room that the work of reporting is fundamentally critical to making sure that we address what we need to address. I'm passionate about these conversations, about ensuring that we're reducing any instances of hate and racism within our community, and certainly looking forward to hearing your insights, your expertise, and just to once again say thank you for the valuable contributions that you're all making. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks very much. That's really helpful. I'll invite people to post in the Q&A section, but I want to lead off with a question about, and this is kind of a Dorothy Dixer, if you like, but it's an important open question. why do we talk about hate incidents as well as hate crime? I mean, in some ways, it'd be easier just to do hate crime. We have a very short list because not many people get to report crime. It's a question of meeting a threshold, of course. But what's the value in looking at hate beyond just things that meet the threshold of crime? Any one of you, Nicole, you've had a lot of experience in policing. You may want to speak to the problems with criminal threshold requirements.
Well, very rarely does a case actually get to court with a hate crime motivation still intact. It is one of the first things that is pled out in the process. And, you know, the Australian Hate Crime Network has done a review of case law, and it is very thin on the ground. And many of the cases that have been got through all of those systems are in fact led by the Jewish community based on their experience of reporting hate crime within their communities over a long period of time. And we must recognise the legacy of the Jewish community in setting up those kinds of processes. I think there's a couple of reasons why we need to capture hate incidents. As I said before, if you want to prove a motivation, then you've got to either have hate speech during that incident of crime, or you've got to have a track record of repeat incidents that don't meet the crime threshold where that motivation is proven. But I think there's also the other side to it in terms of victims and victims' needs, that they need to have what they've experienced recognised and recorded, and for somebody to be witness to that, to understand what impact that has. You know, the saying is that words can't hurt us, but obviously we know they do. And when they're repeated over and over again, one of the key findings from our research is that neighbours are the most common perpetrators of hate incidents and often go into hate crimes. Imagine yourself living next door to somebody who calls you the most awful names every day you walk outside your door. So we need to witness that. We need to be able to sit with victims and acknowledge the harms that those just words actually cause. I think also that, you know, as I said before, the law is socially constructed. 10 years from now, we may be criminalising hate speech. I have concerns about that, given that speech is used in a variety of ways in different contexts, but it gives us almost a canary in the coal mine. It tells us, it warns us where things are happening. And unless we're recording that and we're linking the incidents, you know, I think back to the Pilkington case, the Pilkington and Hardwick case in the UK, which was low-grade harassment from 2 generations of neighbours, where the police did not connect 137 separate incidents against one family. And that ended up in the most horrendous outcome of a murder-suicide. So we need to track the hate incidents so that we can recognise that there may be a recidivist offender within a neighbourhood that may be targeting a range of people who are not part of the, you know, the common notion of who is of that community.
Thank you. Peter, it's difficult to let this question go without asking you for your experiences. You've been involved in prosecutions, you know, the legal system from the side of working as a lawyer. What are your thoughts on how we should best approach this?
Well, I think we need to look at the overall fight against prejudice in a number of different gradations. So Josh spoke about education, and I think personally that is the area of prevention is the primary focus, or should be the primary focus for a lot of policy. And my organisation's made submissions to ACARA, the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, in the context of its current review of the Australian curriculum, about not introducing new line items of curriculum to address this, but to take existing items, look at the current elaborations of those items and weave into them anti-prejudice elements that would cover not just anti-racism, but I mean, the whole gamut of attributes that can be the basis of prejudice. And there's plenty of opportunity there, and it should be done not just in civics and citizenship as a kind of a side subject, but it can be woven into mainstream subjects like English and history, biology, and geography, and you know, what are considered hardcore mainstream subjects, so that from the very earliest ages onwards, obviously in an age-appropriate way, these things can be addressed. So that's the whole area of education and prevention, which I think could be the subject of another workshop. Then you've got civil laws dealing with low-grade, I suppose, low-grade incidents. And they're not low-grade when you're on the receiving end of them, but things like the sorts of things that Nicole spoke about, of neighbours verbally abusing each other and harassing each other and so on. In other words, hate incidents that don't rise to the level of a criminal offence. There are opportunities under state laws and territory laws to for individuals to bring private complaints about those things in certain cases if they rise to a particular level. But very few people have the time, the energy and the resources to do that. And when you think about it, it's, I think as Luke McNamara once expressed it, it's you know, a private remedy for a public wrong. So it's an imperfect system. I'm not suggesting that those civil laws don't serve a useful function. They do, and I'm glad that they're there. We fought very hard, along with other communities, to you know, to persuade government to enact them. But you know, they are kind of very much a band-aid solution at the end of the process, and their utility is limited. And then finally, in the third category, you've got criminality, which is the sort of thing we've been talking about. And I'm sorry to give this long-winded answer, but I think it's necessary to sort of understand the different gradations of hate in our lives. And there, as I see it, there are two categories of criminality. There are crimes that are actually hate crimes in their very definition. They have a hate element in their definition. Such as Section 80.2A and 80.2B of the Commonwealth Criminal Code, which makes it an offence to incite violence on the basis of race and religion, but no other attributes. So that, by the way, is a very imperfect set of sections, because you've got to prove two elements of mens rea. Any prosecutor will tell you it's almost impossible to prove even one in most cases, but you know, to make it two is almost to define the crime out of existence, so that you've just basically got a symbolic thing on the statute books, which never gets used, and to my knowledge, it never has been used. So you know, it's limited in that respect. And then finally, the other category is ordinary garden variety offences like assault or malicious damage to property and so on, which has a hate motivation. It's motivated by a hatred against a community, such as defacing a synagogue or a mosque or a temple with graffiti or smashing up headstones at a cemetery and that sort of thing. So it's that latter category that I was referring to when I say that we particularly need a database across the nation, so that this is the most serious manifestation of racism, where the words have escalated to the point of criminality and criminal action, I should say. And if we don't have something to gauge the temperature of that most serious end of the spectrum, then we don't really know how we're doing at the other lower ends of the spectrum. That's the point I'd make.
Thanks, Peter. And those are really helpful, concrete points. I mean, we want to stop things happening, but we want to have a reliable guide to knowing whether things are getting better or worse and where they're getting better or worse. And we want to use that for education. So trying to find a way of getting that data beyond putting a burden on individuals to go forward and make a complaint, and certainly to avoid the conundrum where, to meet a threshold of criminality, we exclude most things. We need to go beyond that. And it's really encouraging, Josh, to see Victoria moving on banning the swastika. Obviously, if you're running a Buddhist or Hindu or Jain worship site. There are exemptions. It's not about that. It's about neo-Nazi types using Nazi symbolism in deliberate, hateful fashion. What are your thoughts, Josh, on how we best construct a way of getting a comprehensive, broadly representative database?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And just to pick up on the point you made, you're absolutely right. It's about Nazi hate symbols, and that's what the ban will enforce, just to sort of be clear around that technical point. I did just want to pick up a point that Peter made about education. One of the things I should say as a former teacher before I was elected, the Anti-Racism Task Force is looking really closely at education from a very young age, and mechanisms that the government could, initiatives, projects that the government could introduce through the Department of Education in Victoria to educate, basically, from a very early age. Many of these matters that we're talking about is something that I'm very passionate about, and my attention, as Peter was speaking, was drawn to the SBS documentary, The School That Tried to End Racism, which I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with, and I can see heads nodding. And it gave me, as a father to a 2.5-year-old baby girl, or toddler, I should say, she's not quite a baby girl anymore, I think a real sense of why we need to do this work. And I think it's fundamentally important to be able to do this in an education setting. But to go to the question around crime versus incident, of course, we need to design policy and policy responses that include accurate data on both the civil and criminal hate crime and vilification incidents. Hate incidents which would otherwise reach the criminal threshold may not, of course, as others have said, be identified or charged where there's barriers to making complaint, such as the victim's reluctance to report the matter to the police or name the aggressor. And I think that Nicole's practical example of neighbourhood incidents are a prime example of that. So we know that some incidents of hate conduct may not be prosecuted, identified and recorded as prejudice-motivated crimes, for example, where there is not evidential sufficiency for prosecution, where prejudice cannot be substantiated. But we know, and it's my view and the government's view, that the database should include hate conduct under civil provisions, as well as hate incidents which are reported to, but no further action is required. It is a challenge. We need to be honest about this. It's a real challenge, and I think Nicole's example is a really practical, highlights in a really practical sense the challenge that we face, but it's certainly not insurmountable. And I think that the work that our task force can do, which will feed into the anti-racism strategy, should very much be focused around this space and also around that education setting where I think we can do a lot quite quickly.
Thanks. Yeah, I know that Matteo and the team have looked far and wide to try and find examples around the world of systems that work, and this is an area where we do need to do pioneering work. I mean, the Anti-Defamation League in the US has done some really good work, but nowhere is there exactly what we're looking for. So, Australia is a good place to start. Victoria, or New South Wales, or Tasmania, but certainly anywhere. It's important to get that out there. And of course, we're conscious of the fact that, motivation is important when it comes to criminality, but when it comes to how a victim experiences a hateful incident, the person saying something hateful may not even be conscious of being hateful. They may say that they have no bad motivation, and yet the harm done can be tremendous. We are reminded with Adam Goodes and many other sporting heroes of just how much harm has been done to them when people say it was just a joke. Well, it can destroy lives. What's the next step? Where do we go next to get this working? Josh,
I saw Nicole unmute, so I was going to let Nicole go. But Nicole, if you want to go, I'm happy to go after you.
Well, you did mention the work of the Anti-Defamation League in the US, but I think the True Vision model in the UK is, I think, slightly better in that it offers reportees the option of having their incident reported directly to the police via that system. Unfortunately, True Vision was hacked in the late 2000s by the far right, and they managed to collect all the data submitted by victims, and they were then able to re-victimise those people because they had contact details. So the security around such a reporting system, I think the Islamophobia Register of Australia is much more meticulous in ensuring that the incidents reported are real, that they're not just, random data put in by people who would undermine what the system is about. The next steps, I think, is really about going back to the point of the education, we have the Australian community does not know what is a hate crime. After working in the field for 30 years, I still have to explain to people what is a hate crime. And this is unlike the US or the UK, where they have had what we call figurehead hate crime cases. These are hate crime cases that compelled the whole country to know and understand what is a hate crime, whether it's James Bird or Matthew Shepard in the US, or it's Fiona Pilkington or Stephen Lawrence in the UK. Those cases were so public and were in the press for so long that the whole community grew to an understanding of what this means and the impact of it. So yes, start with children and start generating a new generation that does not hate or knows to recognise hate and respond and intervene. But I think we actually have to do a lot of work educating our wider community about what this is. And at this stage, I don't think that we've ever done that apart from with racist violence. Racist violence, I think now is pretty well understood by the community. What I see particularly with ableist violence is that it is dismissed as neglect, or that it was understandable given the burden of disabled people. And already when you start using the words like burden, you understand that what is hateful is so inbuilt into our understandings that we don't even recognise it. And it's so built into the things we say. I see what you mean instead of I understand what you mean. Our language is ableist to start with. So, we've got a lot of work in trying to raise awareness around these things by those that make decisions and those who vote, whilst we educate children.
And Mark Fennell has done a wonderful job with that school that tried to end racism. And you see the kids respond, you think, well, gee, it really impacts on them, but also you can see their thoughts going through their heads and they're understanding, the lights coming on, and you think, well, that's got to be the future. Josh, or Peter, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, it does have to be the future, and it's incredibly complex, as we all know. It's incredibly broad, and as Nicole said, it starts with education, but it permeates and transmits through our workplace, our home environment, where we play sport. Adam Goodes was mentioned, and I remember watching Adam Goodes play reserves for the Swans as a Swan supporter and follow his career and watch the way that he exited the AFL, and what was thrown at him was just simply outrageous. But I think, to go to what Nicole has pointed out, we know, and the government faces significant challenges around social polarisation, around disengagement from the public sphere, around the rise of that exclusion based around ethnicity, religion, culture. And we know that the influence of global conflicts also plays a significant role. The influence of social media, of course. What we need to do is, I think, and what my hope for the Victorian government is, through the work of the task force, is to be able to deliver some of these tangible and practical outcomes. I think, Greg, when you mentioned the shift in those young minds through the program, my focus is yes on systemic long-term reform, but it's also on addressing many of these short-term issues that I think we can do, because we need to, as a government, the role that I'm in basically means that you are limited often by whether it be electoral cycles, whether it be funding constraints. So our view is both long-term but also short-term, because we need to be able to shift the dial on many of these issues. And Peter spoke about the recent riots in Melbourne, and we know that this occurs. So we need to be coming up with some of these solutions, and it is absolutely a significant and ongoing challenge.
It absolutely is. Peter, you've been working on this from well before the days of social media through to the present. What do you see changing, and what do you see as the priority now?
Well, you said the magic words, Greg, social media. I mean, most of our education systems in Australia do teach kids good values as a rule, okay? But the problem is that kids come under so many other influences, not just at home and not just among their peers, but particularly on social media, which is a purveyor of the exact antithesis of the sorts of values that they're taught at school, and which hopefully we would hope that they get taught at home and in other traditional contexts. So if education against prejudice is going to be effective, it's not sufficient to just teach the positive and to accentuate the positive. I mean, yes, of course, you've got to do that. You've got to explain to them why a multicultural Australia has worked so well and why that means that we've got to respect each other and so on. But that's not enough. You've also got to teach kids, when it's appropriate, to be able to identify the negatives. They need to be able to say, that is anti-Semitism, that is Islamophobia, that's anti-Asian, that's anti-First Nations. I can see that. I recognise it, because they're taught that, and they're taught not only to identify it and recognise it, but to respond to it in an appropriate way, which is not always easy. And that program, the School that Tried to Abolish Racism, has highlighted some of the, that's a pretty good nurturing environment by the look of it. But very often, kids find themselves in a very toxic environment. And so we need to be able to arm them with the intellectual tools and also I don't know how to put this, but just the personality tools to be able to be strong enough to be able to respond to really ugly manifestations of prejudices they may encounter in a way that doesn't expose them to harm and to risk, teaches them to reach out to others who also recognise the problem, and to fight in to have the personal skills and also the organisational skills to deal with it. It's a very difficult thing to do, and kids particularly hate to stand out. They want to be part of the group. They want to be seen as part of the team. They don't want to expose themselves to risk. It's all understandable, but unless you address the negatives as well as educate them to the positives, I'm afraid it's going to get lost the moment they encounter some of the ugly realities of the world. And that's what we need to be able to prepare them for.
Thank you, Peter. Well, thank you, Nicole, Josh. Peter, you've been brilliant. Thank you for the good work you do every day. Look, this is the beginning of a good conversation, but it's hardly enough, stopping here. Otherwise, Mateo is going to take mute my mic if I don't pass to him in a minute. But let's do this again. Let's get this three of you back, if you don't mind, and have this conversation again and go a bit further. And hopefully we'll hear some progress on how things are going. But time to pass back to Mateo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg, Nicole, Peter, and Josh. It was such a great panel, a beautiful way to end the day and actually the whole conference. We went really to the heart of what tackling hate means and the project. which means not just collecting data, but also support for victims, and ultimately changing society, using data to affect social change. So I have the privilege to wrap up the day, and I want to give my warmest thanks to all our panelists today for giving your time and expertise to the workshop, for supporting the Tackling Hate project and CRIS, and for the tireless and committed approach to advocating for our communities. Today, we made a deep dive into building a database of hate. We had a focus on Victoria, and we mainly, not only because Peter, of course, demonstrates the opposite, but we mainly listened to government agencies, including law enforcement this morning, the Victorian Information Commission, the Human Rights Commission, the Victorian government, now with Josh. Government voices are very important, but communities are our key stakeholders. So I want just to stress this. So of course, to discuss all the aspects and involve all the stakeholders, it will take a week of discussions. So today we decided to go deep into one aspect of building the database, but it's not the only one. Of course, this is what I wanted to say. So community partners have been and will continue to be our key stakeholder in our project, and for CRIS in general. So we hope that today's discussion was useful for everyone sitting at the table and interested in tackling hate. Perhaps most importantly, by working together to codify hate incidents, we aim to take the burden away from hate victims and ensuring that acts that are reported achieve the best possible outcomes for victims and for their communities. Because we know hate not only affects victims, but broader communities, of course. So we have seen today the amount of work required to build a database of hate, but I am really encouraged that this collaboration seems to be well within our capabilities and ambitions. In particular, hearing from Josh, Rachel, Dixon, Ro Allen, I think we have a real important start in Victoria. We heard from Paul this morning about the success of the UK's cooperation between government, communities, and law enforcement in tackling hate, but also institutional and systemic racism, hate speech, and the broader culture around bias and prejudice. We have made great progress today in the discussion about what a hate database can and should look like by bringing together this variety of speakers and through engaging with your questions, which have been really important in challenging the discourse, we understood that we have to work as a society to tackle this problem. I want really to encourage you to stay involved. I mean, this is really the first step towards achieving these broader aim of building a better society, more inclusive and fairer. Look, often data and analysis are reported as cold and clinical, but tackling hate really seeks to achieve social justice. Look, this project, to conclude, is just one of nearly 20 CRIS projects that have been designed in this way with communities, for communities, and backed by rigorous academic research. Of course, we could not dedicate one day each, but this was just a great example of how much research is being done through CRIS. So I want to thank all the people who have contributed to Understanding Everyday Resilience Conference and to the Tackling Hate workshop over the past 3 days. In particular, thanks to our director, Michelle Grossman, who inspires us all with her brilliant research and vision for the center, and who has made sure that this relevant and timely conference came together despite the challenges of COVID. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Sharam, for guiding us through the conference. Thank you to all our panelists and to our audience, really, our colleagues, friends, and supporters. Have a lovely rest of the week. Bye.